This moment of the storm. Back on Earth, my old philosophy prof, possibly because he'd misplaced his lecture notes, came into the classroom one day and scrutinized his 16 victims for the space of half a minute. Satisfied then that a sufficiently profound tone had been established, he asked, "What is a man?" He had known exactly what he was doing. He'd had an hour and a half to kill, and 11 of the 16 were co-eds, 9 of them in liberal arts, and the other 2 stuck with an area requirement. One of the other 2, who was in the pre-med program, proceeded to provide a strict biological classification. The prof, McNitt was his name, I suddenly recall, nodded then and asked, "Is that all?" And there was his hour and a half. I learned that man is the reasoning animal, man is the one who laughs. Man is greater than beasts, but less than angels. Man is the one who watches himself watch himself doing things he knows are absurd. This from a comparative lit gal. Man is the culture-transmitting animal. Man is the spirit which aspires, affirms, loves, the one who uses tools, buries his dead, devises religions, and the one who tries to define himself. That last from Paul Schwartz, my roommate, which I thought pretty good on the spur of the moment. Wonder whatever became of Paul. Anyhow, to most of these I say perhaps, or partly, but, or just plain crap. I still think mine was the best, because I had a chance to try it out on Tierra del Cygnus, land of the swan. I'd said, man is the sum total of everything he has done, wishes to do or not to do, and wishes he had done or hadn't. Stop and think about it for a minute. It's purposely as general as the others, but it's got room in it for the biology and the laughing and the aspiring, as well as the culture-transmitting, the love, and the room full of mirrors, and the defining. I even left the door open for religion, you'll note. But it's limiting, too. Ever met an oyster to whom the final phrases apply? Tierra del Cygnus, land of the swan. Delightful name. Delightful place, too, for quite a while. It was there that I saw man's definitions one by one wiped from off the big blackboard until only mine was left. My radio had been playing more static than usual. That's all. For several hours there was no other indication of what was to come. My 130 eyes had watched Betty all morning, on that clear, cool spring day with the sun pouring down its honey and lightning upon the amber fields, flowing through the streets, invading western storefronts, drying curbstones, and washing the olive and umber buds that spread the skin of the trees there by the roadway. And the light that wrung the blue from the flag before Town Hall made orange mirrors out of windows, chased purple and violet patches across the shoulders of St. Stephen's Range, some 30 miles distant, and came down upon the forest at its feet like some supernatural madman with 1,000,000 buckets of paint, each of a different shade of green, yellow, orange, blue, and red, to daub with miles-wide brushes at its heaving sea of growth. Mornings the sky is cobalt, midday is turquoise, and sunset is emeralds and rubies hard and flashing. It was halfway between cobalt and sea mist at 1100 hours when I watched Betty with my 130 eyes and saw nothing to indicate what was about to be. There was only that persistent piece of static accompanying the piano and strings within my portable. It's funny how the mind personifies, engenders. Ships are always women. You say, she's a good old tub, or she's a fast, tough number, this one, slapping a bulwark and feeling the aura of femininity that clings to the vessel's curves. Or conversely, he's a bastard to start, that little Sam, as you kick the auxiliary engine in an inland transport vehicle. And hurricanes are always women, and moons, and seas. Cities, though, are different. Generally, they're neuter. Nobody calls New York or San Francisco he or she. Usually, cities are just it. Sometimes, however, they do come to take on the attributes of sex. Usually, this is in the case of small cities near to the Mediterranean, back on Earth. Perhaps this is because of the sex-ridden nouns of the languages which prevail in that vicinity, in which case it tells us more about the inhabitants than it does about the habitations. But I feel it goes deeper than that. Betty was Beta Station for less than 10 years. After 2 decades she was Betty officially, by act of town council. Why? Well, I felt at the time, 90-some years ago, and still feel, that it was because she was what she was, a place of rest and repair, of surface-cooked meals and of new voices, new faces, of landscapes, weather, and natural light again, after that long haul through the big night, with its casting away of so much. She is not home, she is seldom destination, but she is like unto both. When you come upon light and warmth and music after darkness and cold silence, it is woman. The old-time Mediterranean sailor must have felt it when he first spied port at the end of a voyage. I felt it when I first saw Beta Station, Betty, and the second time I saw her also. I am her hell-cop. When 6 or 7 of my 130 eyes flickered, then saw again, and the music was suddenly washed away by a wave of static, it was then that I began to feel uneasy. I called Weather Central for a report, and the recorded girl voice told me that seasonal rains were expected in the afternoon or early evening. I hung up and switched an eye from ventral to dorsal vision. Not a cloud, not a ripple, only a formation of green-winged sky-toads heading north across the field of the lens. I switched it back, and I watched the traffic flow slowly and without congestion along Betty's prim, well-tended streets. 3 men were leaving the bank, and 2 more were entering. I recognized the 3 who were leaving, and in my mind I waved as I passed by. All was still at the post office, and patterns of normal activity lay upon the steel mills, the stockyard, the plastic-synth plants, the airport, the spacer pads, and the surfaces of all the shopping complexes. Vehicles came and went at the inland transport vehicle garages, crawling from the rainbow forest and the mountains beyond like dark slugs, leaving tread trails to mark their comings and goings through wilderness. And the fields of the countryside were still yellow and brown, with occasional patches of green and pink. The country houses, mainly simple. A-frame affairs were chisel blade, spike-tooth, spire, and steeple, each with a big lightning rod and dipped in many colors, and scooped up in the cups of my seeing and dumped out again, as I sent my eyes on their rounds, and tended my gallery of 130 changing pictures on the big wall of the Trouble Center, there atop the watchtower of Town Hall. The static came and went until I had to shut off the radio. Fragments of music are worse than no music at all. My eyes, coasting weightless along magnetic lines, began to blink. I knew then that we were in for something. I sent an eye scurrying off toward St. Stephen's at full speed, which meant a wait of about 20 minutes until it topped the range. Another I sent straight up, skywards, which meant perhaps 10 minutes for a long shot of the same scene. Then I put the auto-scan in full charge of operations and went downstairs for a cup of coffee. I entered the mayor's outer office, winked at Lottie, the receptionist, and glanced at the inner door. "Mayor in?" I asked. I got an occasional smile from Lottie, a slightly heavy but well-rounded girl of indeterminate age and intermittent acne, but this wasn't one of the occasions. "Yes," she said, returning to the papers on her desk. "Alone?" She nodded, and her earrings danced. Dark eyes and dark complexion, she could have been kind of sharp if only she'd fixed her hair and used more makeup. Well, I crossed to the door and knocked. "Who?" asked the mayor. "Me," I said, opening it. "Godfrey Justin Holmes. God for short. I want someone to drink coffee with, and you're elected." She turned in her swivel chair, away from the window she had been studying, and her blonde hair, white hair fused, short and parted in the middle, gave a little stir as she turned, like a sun-shot snowdrift struck by sudden winds. She smiled and said, "I'm busy." Eyes green, chin small, cute little ears, I love them all, from an anonymous valentine I'd sent her 2 months previous, and true. "But not too busy to have coffee with God," she stated. "Have a throne, and I'll make us some instant." I did, and she did. While she was doing it, I leaned back, lit a cigarette I'd borrowed from her canister, and remarked, "Looks like rain." "Uh-huh," she said. "Not just making conversation," I told her. "There's a bad storm brewing somewhere over St. Stephen's, I think. I'll know real soon." "Yes, grandfather," she said, bringing me my coffee. "You old-timers with all your aches and pains are often better than Weather Central. It's an established fact. I won't argue." She smiled, frowned, then smiled again. I set my cup on the edge of her desk. "Just wait and see," I said. "If it makes it over the mountains, it'll be a nasty high-voltage job. It's already jazzing up reception." Big bowed white blouse and black skirt around a well-kept figure. She'd be 40 in the fall, but she'd never completely tamed her facial reflexes, which was most engaging so far as I was concerned. Spontaneity of expression so often vanishes so soon. I could see the sort of child she'd been by looking at her, listening to her now. The thought of being 40 was bothering her again, too, I could tell. She always kids me about age when age is bothering her. See, I'm around 35, actually, which makes me her junior by a bit, but she'd heard her grandfather speak of me when she was a kid, before I came back again this last time. I'd filled out the balance of his 2-year term back when Betty Beta's first mayor, Wyeth, had died after 2 months in office. I was born 597 years ago on Earth, but I spent about 562 of those years sleeping during my long jaunts between the stars. I've made a few more trips than a few others. Consequently, I'm an anachronism. I am really, of course, only as old as I look, but still people always seem to feel that I've cheated somehow, especially women in their middle years. Sometimes it is most disconcerting. Eleanor, I said, your term will be up in November. Are you still thinking of running again? She took off her narrow, elegantly trimmed glasses and brushed her eyelids with thumb and forefinger. Then she took a sip of coffee. I haven't made up my mind. I ask not for press release purposes, I said, but for my own. Really, I haven't decided, she told me. I don't know. Okay, just checking. Let me know if you do. I drank some coffee. After a time, she said, Dinner Saturday, as usual? Yes, good. I'll tell you then. Fine, capital. As she looked down into her coffee, I saw a little girl staring into a pool, waiting for it to clear to see her reflection or to see the bottom of the pool, or perhaps both. She smiled at whatever it was she finally saw. A bad storm? She asked me. Yep, feel it in my bones. Tell it to go away? Tried, don't think it will, though. Better batten some hatches, then. It wouldn't hurt, and it might help. The weather satellite will be overhead in another half hour. You'll have something sooner? Think so, probably any minute. I finished my coffee, washed out the cup. Let me know right away what it is. Check. Thanks for the coffee. Lottie was still working and did not look up as I passed. Upstairs again, my highest eye was now high enough. I stood it on its tail and collected a view of the distance. Fleecy mobs of clouds boiled and frothed on the other side of St. Stephen's. The mountain range seemed a breakwall, a dam, a rickety shoreline. Beyond it, the waters were troubled. My other eye was almost in position. I waited the space of half a cigarette, then it delivered me a sight. Gray and wet and impenetrable, a curtain across the countryside. That's what I saw. And advancing. I called Eleanor. It's gonna rain, chillin', I said. Worth some sandbags? Possibly. Better be ready, then. Okay, thanks. I returned to my watching. Tierra del Cygnus, Land of the Swan. Delightful name. It refers to both the planet and its sole continent. How to describe the world like quick? Well, roughly Earth-size, actually a bit smaller and more watery. As for the main land mass, first hold a mirror up to South America to get the big bump from the right side over to the left, then rotate it 90 degrees in a counterclockwise direction and push it up into the northern hemisphere. We got that? Good. Now grab it by the tail and pull. Stretch it another 600 or 700 miles, slimming down the middle as you do, and let the last 500 or 600 fall across the equator. There you have Cygnus, its big gulf partly in the tropics, partly not. Just for the sake of thoroughness while you're about it, break Australia into 8 pieces and drop them about at random down in the southern hemisphere, calling them after the first 8 letters in the Greek alphabet. Put a big scoop of vanilla at each pole, and don't forget to tilt the globe about 18 degrees before you leave. Thanks. I recalled my wandering eyes, and I kept a few of the others turned toward St. Stephen's until the cloud banks breasted the range about an hour later. By then, though, the weather satellite had passed over and picked the thing up also. It reported quite an extensive cloud cover on the other side. The storm had sprung up quickly, as they often do here on Cygnus. Often, too, they disperse just as quickly after an hour or so of heaven's artillery. But then there are the bad ones, sometimes lingering and bearing more thunderbolts in their quivers than any earth storm. Betty's position, too, is occasionally precarious, though its advantages in general offset its liabilities. We are located on the Gulf about 20 miles inland, and are approximately 3 miles removed in the main from a major river, the Noble. Part of Betty does extend down to its banks, but this is a smaller part. We are almost a strip city, falling mainly into an area some 7 miles in length and 2 miles wide, stretching inland, east from the river, and running roughly parallel to the distant seacoast. Around 80% of the 100,000 population is concentrated about the business district, 5 miles in from the river. We are not the lowest land about, but we are far from being the highest. We are certainly the most level in the area. This latter feature, as well as our nearness to the equator, was a deciding factor in the establishment of Beta Station. Some other things were our proximity both to the ocean and to a large river. There are 9 other cities on the continent, all of them younger and smaller, and 3 of them located upriver from us. We are the potential capital of a potential country. We're a good, smooth, easy landing site for drop boats from orbiting interstellar vehicles, and we have major assets for future growth and coordination when it comes to expanding across the continent. Our original raison d'etre, though, was stopover, repair point, supply depot, and refreshment stand, physical and psychological, on the way out to other, more settled worlds further along the line. Sig was discovered later than many others. It just happened that way, and the others got off to earlier starts. Hence, the others generally attract more colonists. We are still quite primitive. Self-sufficiency, in order to work on our population land scale, demanded a society on the order of that of the mid-19th century in the American Southwest, at least for purposes of getting started. Even now, SIG is still partly on a natural economy system, although Earth Central technically determines the coin of the realm. Why stop over if you sleep most of the time between the stars? Think about it a while, and I'll tell you later if you're right. The thunderheads rose in the east, sending billows and streamers this way and that, until it seemed from the formations that St. Stephen's was a balcony full of monsters, leaning and craning their necks over the rail in the direction of the stage, us. Cloud piled upon slate-colored cloud, and then the wall slowly began to topple. I heard the first rumbles of thunder almost half an hour after lunch, so I knew it wasn't my stomach. Despite all my eyes, I moved to a window to watch. It was like a big gray aerial glacier plowing the sky. There was a wind now, for I saw the trees suddenly quiver and bow down. This would be our first storm of the season. The turquoise fell back before it, and finally it smothered the sun itself. Then there were drops upon the window pane, then rivulets. Flint-like, the highest peaks of St. Stephen's scraped its belly and were showered with sparks. After a moment it bumped into something with a terrible crash, and the rivulets on the quartz panes turned into rivers. I went back to my gallery to smile at dozens of views of people scurrying for shelter. A smart few had umbrellas and raincoats. The rest ran like blazes. People never pay attention to weather reports. This, I believe, is a constant factor in man's psychological makeup, stemming probably from an ancient tribal distrust of the shaman. You want them to be wrong. If they're right, then they're somehow superior, and this is even more uncomfortable than getting wet. I remembered then that I had forgotten my raincoat, umbrella, and rubbers. But it had been a beautiful morning, and W.C. could have been wrong. Well, I had another cigarette and leaned back in my big chair. No storm in the world could knock my eyes out of the sky. I switched on the filters and sat and watched the rain pour past. 5 hours later it was still raining and rumbling and dark. I'd had hopes that it would let up by quitting time, but when Chuck Fuller came around the picture still hadn't changed any. Chuck was my relief that night, the evening hell cop. He seated himself beside my desk. "You're early," I said. "They don't start paying you for another hour." "Too wet to do anything but sit. Rather sit here than at home." "Leaky roof?" He shook his head. "Mother-in-law visiting again." I nodded. "One of the disadvantages of a small world." He clasped his hands behind his neck and leaned back in the chair, staring off in the direction of the window. I could feel one of his outbursts coming. "You know how old I am?" he asked after a while. "No," I said, which was a lie. He was 29. 27, he told me, and going to be 28 soon. "Know where I've been?" No. No place, that's where. I was born and raised on this crummy world, and I married and I settled down here, and I've never been off it. Never could afford it when I was younger. Now I've got a family." He leaned forward again, rested his elbows on his knees like a kid. Chuck would look like a kid when he was 50. Blonde hair, close-cropped, pug nose, kind of scrawny, takes a suntan quickly, and well. Maybe he'd act like a kid at 52. I'll never know. I didn't say anything because I didn't have anything to say. He was quiet for a long while again. Then he said, "You've been around." After a minute he went on. "You were born on Earth. Earth! And you visited lots of other worlds, too, before I was even born. Earth is only a name to me, and pictures. And all the others, they're the same. Pictures, names." I waited. Then after I grew tired of waiting, I said, "Miniver Chivi, child of scorn. What does that mean?" "It's the beginning to an ancient poem. It's an ancient poem now, but it wasn't really ancient when I was a boy, just old. I had friends, relatives, even in-laws once myself. They are not just bones now, they are dust, real dust, not metaphorical dust. The past 15 years seem 15 years to me, the same as to you, but they're not. They are already many chapters back in the history books. Whenever you travel between the stars, you automatically bury the past. The world you leave will be filled with strangers if you ever return, or caricatures of your friends, your relatives, even yourself. It's no great trick to be a grandfather at 60, a great-grandfather at 75 or 80, but go away for 300 years and then come back and meet your great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandson who happens to be 55 years old and puzzled when you look him up. It shows you just how alone you really are. You are not simply a man without a country or without a world, you are a man without a time. You and the centuries do not belong to each other. You are like the rubbish that drifts between the stars." "It would be worth it," he said. I laughed. I'd had to listen to his gripes every month or two for over a year and a half. It had never bothered me so much before, so I guess it was a cumulative effect that day. The rain, and Saturday Night Next, and my recent library visits, and his complaining, that had set me off. His last comment had been too much. It would be worth it. What could I say to that? I laughed. He turned bright red. "You're laughing at me!" He stood up and glared down. "No, I'm not," I said. "I'm laughing at me. I shouldn't have been bothered by what you said, but I was. That tells me something funny about me." "What?" "I'm getting sentimental in my old age, and that's funny." "Oh." He turned his back on me and walked over to the window and stared out. Then he jammed his hands into his pockets and turned around and looked at me. "Aren't you happy?" he asked. "Really, I mean. You've got money and no strings on you. You could pick up and leave on the next IV that passes if you wanted to." "Sure I'm happy," I told him. "My coffee was cold. Forget it." "Oh," again. He turned back to the window in time to catch a bright flash full in the face and to have to compete with thunder to get his next words out. "I'm sorry," I heard him say, as in the distance. "It just seems to me that you should be one of the happiest guys around." "I am. It's the weather today. It's got everybody down in the mouth, yourself included." "Yeah, you're right," he said. "Look at it rain, will you? Haven't seen any rain in months." "They've been saving it all up for today." He chuckled. "I'm going down for a cup of coffee and a sandwich before I sign on. Can I bring you anything?" "No, thanks." "Okay, see you in a little while." He walked out whistling. He never stays depressed. Like a kid's moods, his moods up and down, up and down. And he's a hell cop. Probably the worst possible job for him, having to keep his attention in one place for so long. They say the job title comes from the name of an antique flying vehicle. A helicopter, I think. We sent our eyes on their appointed rounds, and they can hover or soar or back up just like those old machines could. We patrol the city and the adjacent countryside. Law enforcement isn't much of a problem on SIG. We never peek in windows or send an eye into a building without an invitation. Our testimony is admissible in court, or if we're fast enough to press a couple buttons, the tape that we make does an even better job, and we can dispatch live or robot cops in a hurry, depending on which will do a better job. There isn't much crime on SIG, though, despite the fact that everybody carries a sidearm of some kind, even little kids. Everybody knows pretty much what their neighbors are up to, and there aren't too many places for a fugitive to run. We're mainly aerial traffic cops with an eye out for local wildlife, which is the reason for all the sidearms. SPCU is what we call the latter function, Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Us, which is the reason each of my 130 eyes has 6 .45 caliber eyelashes. There are things like the cute little panda puppy, about 3 feet high at the shoulder when it sits down on its rear like a teddy bear, and with big, square, silky ears, a curly pinto coat, large, limpid brown eyes, pink tongue, button nose, powder-puff tail, sharp little white teeth more poisonous than a Quamada Island viper's, and possessed of a way with mammal entrails like unto the way of an imaginative cat with a rope of catnip. Then there's a snapper, which looks as mean as it sounds, a feathered reptile with 3 horns on its armored head, one beneath each eye like a tusk, and one curving skyward from the top of its nose. Legs about 18 inches long, and a 4-foot tail which it raises straight into the air whenever it jogs along at greyhound speed, and which it swings like a sandbag, and a mouth full of long, sharp teeth. Also, there are amphibious things which come from the ocean by way of the river on occasion. I'd rather not speak of them, they're kind of ugly and vicious. Anyway, those are some of the reasons why there are hell cops, not just on SIG, but on many, many frontier worlds. I've been employed in that capacity on several of them, and I found that an experienced HC can always find a job out here. It's like being a professional clerk back home. Chuck took longer than I thought he would, came back after I was technically off duty, looked happy, though, so I didn't say anything. There was some pale lipstick on his collar and a grin on his face, so I bade him good morrow, picked up my cane, and departed in the direction of the big washing machine. It was coming down too hard for me to go the 2 blocks to my car on foot. I called a cab and waited another 15 minutes. Eleanor had decided to keep mayor's hours, and she departed shortly after lunch, and almost the entire staff had been released an hour early because of the weather. Consequently, Town Hall was full of dark offices and echoes. I waited in the hallway behind the main door, listening to the purr of the rain as it fell, and hearing its gurgle as it found its way into the gutters. It beat the street and shook the window panes and made the windows cold to touch. I'd planned on spending the evening at the library, but I changed my plans as I watched the weather happen. Tomorrow or the next day, I decided. It was an evening for a good meal, a hot bath, my own books, and brandy, and early to bed. It was good sleeping weather, if nothing else. A cab pulled up in front of the hall and blew its horn. I ran. The next day the rain let up for perhaps an hour in the morning. Then a slow drizzle began, and it did not stop again. It went on to become a steady downpour by afternoon. The following day was Friday, which I always have off, and I was glad that it was. Put dittos under Thursday's weather report, that's Friday. But I decided to do something anyway. I lived down in that section of town near the river. The Noble was swollen, and the rains kept adding to it. Sewers had begun to clog and back up. Water ran in the streets. The rain kept coming down and widening the puddles and lakelets, and it was accompanied by drum solos in the sky and the falling of bright forks and saw blades. Dead sky toads were washed along the gutters like burnt-out fireworks. Ball lightning drifted across town square. St. Elmo's fire clung to the flagpole, the watchtower, and the big statue of Wyeth, trying to look heroic. I headed uptown to the library, pushing my car slowly through the countless beaded curtains. The big furniture movers in the sky were obviously non-union because they weren't taking any coffee breaks. Finally, I found a parking place, and I umbrellaed my way to the library and entered. I have become something of a bibliophile in recent years. It is not so much that I hunger and thirst after knowledge, but that I am news-starved. It all goes back to my position in the big Mixmaster. Admitted there are some things faster than light, like the phase velocities of radio waves in ion plasma, or the tips of the ion-modulated light beams of Duckbill, the comm setup back in Sol system, whenever the hinges of the beak snap shut on Earth. But these are highly restricted instances, with no application whatsoever to the passage of shiploads of people and objects between the stars. You can't exceed light speed when it comes to the movement of matter. You can edge up pretty close, but that's about it. Life can be suspended, though. That's easy. It can be switched off and switched back on again with no trouble at all. This is why I have lasted so long. If we can't speed up the ships, we can slow down the people, slow them until they stop, and let the vessel, moving at near light speed, take half a century, or more if it needs it, to convey its passengers to where they are going. This is why I am very alone. Each little death means resurrection into both another land and another time. I have had several, and this is why I have become a bibliophile. News travels slowly as the ships and the people. Buy a newspaper before you hop aboard a ship, and it will still be a newspaper when you reach your destination, but back where you bought it, it will be considered an historical document. Send a letter back to Earth, and your correspondent's grandson may be able to get an answer back to your great-grandson, if the message makes real good connections and both kids live long enough. All the little libraries out here are full of rare books, first editions of bestsellers which people pick up before they leave someplace else, and which they often donate after they've finished. We assume that these books have entered the public domain by the time they reach here, and we reproduce them and circulate our own editions. No author has ever sued, and no reproducer has ever been around to be sued by representatives, designates, or assigns. We are completely autonomous, and are always behind the times because there is a transit lag which cannot be overcome. Earth Central, therefore, exercises about as much control over us as a boy jiggling a broken string while looking up at his kite. Perhaps Yeats had something like this in mind when he wrote that fine line, "Things fall apart, the center cannot hold." I doubt it, but I still have to go to the library to read the news. The day melted around me. The words flowed across the screen in my booth as I read newspapers and magazines untouched by human hands, and the waters flowed across Betty's acres, pouring down from the mountains now, washing the floors of the forest, churning our fields to peanut butter, flooding basements, soaking its way through everything, and tracking our streets with mud. I hit the library cafeteria for lunch, where I learned from a girl in a green apron and yellow skirts, which swished pleasantly, that the sandbag crews were now hard at work, and that there was no eastbound traffic past Town Square. After lunch I put on my slicker and boots and walked up that way. Sure enough, the sandbag wall was already waist-high across Main Street, but then the water was swirling around at ankle level, and more of it falling every minute. I looked up at old Wyeth's statue. His halo had gone away now, which was sort of to be expected. It had made an honest mistake, and realized it after a short time. He was holding a pair of glasses in his left hand and sort of glancing down at me as though a bit apprehensive, wondering perhaps there inside all that bronze if I would tell on him now and ruin his hard, wet, greenish splendor. Tell? I guess I was the only one left around who really remembered the man. He had wanted to be the father of this great new country, literally, and he'd tried awfully hard. 3 months in office, and I'd had to fill out the rest of the 2-year term. The death certificate gave the cause as heart stoppage, but it didn't mention the piece of lead which had helped slow things down a bit. Everybody involved is gone now, the irate husband, the frightened wife, the coroner, all but me. And I won't tell anybody if Wyeth's statue won't, because he's a hero now, and we need heroes' statues out here even more than we do heroes. He did engineer a nice piece of relief work during the Butler Township floods, and he may as well be remembered for that. I winked at my old boss, and the rain dripped from his nose and fell into the puddle at my feet. I walked back to the library through loud sounds and bright flashes, hearing the splashing and the curses of the work crew as the men began to block off another street. Black overhead, and I drifted past. I waved, and the filter snapped up and back down again. I think H.C. John Keynes was tending shop that afternoon, but I'm not sure. Suddenly the heavens opened up, and it was like standing under a waterfall. I reached for a wall, and there wasn't one, slipped then, and managed to catch myself with my cane before I flopped. I found a doorway and huddled. 10 minutes of lightning and thunder followed. Then, after the blindness and the deafness passed away and the rains had eased a bit, I saw that the street, 2nd Avenue, had become a river. Bearing all sorts of garbage, papers, hats, sticks, mud, it sloshed past my niche, gurgling nastily. It looked to be over my boot-tops, so I waited for it to subside. It didn't. It got right up in there with me and started to play footsie. So then seemed as good a time as any. Things certainly weren't getting any better. I tried to run, but with filled boots the best you can manage is a fast wade, and my boots were filled after 3 steps. That shot the afternoon. How can you concentrate on anything with wet feet? I made it back to the parking lot, then churned my way homeward, feeling like a riverboat captain who really wanted to be a camel driver. It seemed more like evening than afternoon when I pulled up into my damp but unflooded garage. It seemed more like night than evening in the alley I cut through on my way to my apartment's back entrance. I hadn't seen the sun for several days, and it's funny how much you can miss it when it takes a vacation. The sky was a sable dome, and the high brick walls of the alley were cleaner than I'd ever seen them, despite the shadows. I stayed close to the left-hand wall in order to miss some of the rain. As I had driven along the river, I'd noticed that it was already reaching after the high water marks on the sides of the piers. The Noble was a big, spoiled blood sausage ready to burst its skin. A lightning flash showed me the whole alley, and I slowed in order to avoid puddles. I moved ahead, thinking of dry socks and dry martinis, turned a corner to the right, and it struck at me. An org. Half of its segmented body was reared at a 45-degree angle above the pavement, which placed its wide head with the traffic signal eyes saying stop about 3.5 feet off the ground, as it rolled toward me on all its pale little legs, with its mouthful of death aimed at my middle. I pause now in my narrative for a long digression concerning my childhood, which, if you will but consider the circumstances, I was obviously quite fresh on in an instant. Born, raised, educated on Earth, I had worked 2 summers in a stockyard while going to college. I still remember the smells and the noises of the cattle. I used to prod them out of the pens and on their way up the last mile. And I remember the smells and noises of the university, the formaldehyde in the biolabs, the sounds of freshmen slaughtering French verbs, the overpowering aroma of coffee mixed with cigarette smoke in the student union, the splash of the newly pinned frat man as his brothers tossed him into the lagoon down in front of the art museum, the sounds of ignored chapel bells and class bells, the smell of the lawn after the year's first mowing, with big black Andy perched on his grass-chewing monster, baseball cap down to his eyebrows, cigarette somehow not burning his left cheek. And always, always, the tick-tick-snick stamp as I moved up or down the strip. I had not wanted to take general physical education, but 4 semesters of it were required. The only out was to take a class in a special sport. I picked fencing, because tennis, basketball, boxing, wrestling, handball, judo all sounded too strenuous, and I couldn't afford a set of golf clubs. Little did I suspect what would follow this choice. It was as strenuous as any of the others, and more than several. But I liked it. So I tried out for the team in my sophomore year, made it on the épée squad, and picked up 3 varsity letters because I stuck with it through my senior year. Which all goes to show, cattle who persevere in looking for an easy way out still wind up in the abattoir, but they may enjoy the trip a little more. When I came out here on the raw frontier, where people all carry weapons, I had my cane made. It combines the better features of the épée and the cattle prod. Only it is the kind of prod which, if you were to prod cattle with, they would never move again. Over 800 volts, max, when the tip touches, if the stud in the handle is depressed properly. My arm shot out and up, and my fingers depressed the stud properly as it moved. That was it for the org. A noise came from between the rows of razor blades in its mouth as I scored a touch on its soft underbelly and whipped my arm away to the side, a noise halfway between an exhalation and peep, and that was it for the org, short for organism with a long name which I can't remember. I switched off my cane and walked around it. It was one of those things which sometimes come out of the river. I remember that I looked back at it 3 times, then I switched the cane on again at max and kept it that way till I was inside my apartment with the door locked behind me and all the lights burning. Then I permitted myself to tremble, and after a while I changed my socks and mixed my drink. May your alleys be safe from orgs. Saturday. More rain. Wetness was all. The entire east side had been shored with sandbags. In some places they served only to create sandy waterfalls, where otherwise the streams would have flowed more evenly and perhaps a trifle more clearly. In other places they held it back for a while. By then there were 6 deaths as a direct result of the rains. By then there had been fires caused by the lightning, accidents by the water, sicknesses by the dampness, the cold. By then, property damages were beginning to mount pretty high. Everyone was tired and angry and miserable and wet by then. This included me. Though Saturday was Saturday, I went to work. I worked in Eleanor's office with her. We had the big relief map spread on a table, and 6 mobile eye screens were lined against one wall. 6 eyes hovered above the half-dozen emergency points and kept us abreast of the actions taken upon them. Several new telephones and a big radio set stood on the desk. 5 ashtrays looked as if they wanted to be empty, and the coffee pot chuckled cynically at human activity. The Noble had almost reached its high-water mark. We were not an isolated storm center by any means. Upriver, Butler Township was hurting, Swan's Nest was adrip, Laurie was weeping into the river, and the wilderness in between was shaking and streaming. Even though we were in direct contact, we went into the field on 3 occasions that morning. Once when the north-south bridge over the Lance River collapsed and was washed down toward the Noble as far as the bend by the Mack steel mill. Again when the Wildwood Cemetery, set up on a storm-gouged hill to the east, was plowed deeply, graves opened, and several coffins set awash. And finally when 3 houses full of people toppled far to the east. Eleanor's small flyer was buffeted by the winds as we fought our way through to these sites for on-the-spot supervision. I navigated almost completely by instruments. Downtown proper was accommodating evacuees left and right by then. I took 3 showers that morning and changed clothes twice. Things slowed down a bit in the afternoon, including the rain. The cloud cover didn't break, but a drizzle point was reached which permitted us to gain a little on the waters. Retaining walls were reinforced, evacuees were fed and dried, some of the rubbish was cleaned up. 4 of the 6 eyes were returned to their patrols because 4 of the emergency points were no longer emergency points. And we wanted all of the eyes for the org patrol. Inhabitants of the drenched forest were also on the move. 7 snappers and a horde of panda puppies were shot that day, as well as a few crawly things from the troubled waters of the Noble, not to mention assorted branch snakes, sting bats, borers, and land eels. By 1900 hours it seemed that a stalemate had been achieved. Eleanor and I climbed into her flyer and drifted skyward. We kept rising. Finally there was a hiss as the cabin began to pressurize itself. The night was all around us. Eleanor's face in the light from the instrument panel was a mask of weariness. She raised her hands to her temples as if to remove it, and then when I looked back again it appeared that she had. A faint smile lay across her lips now, and her eyes sparkled. A stray strand of hair shadowed her brow. "Where are you taking me?" she asked. "Up high," said I, "above the storm." "Why?" "It's been many days," I said, "since we have seen an uncluttered sky." "True," she agreed, and as she leaned forward to light a cigarette, I noticed that the part in her hair had gone all askew. I wanted to reach out and straighten it for her, but I didn't. We plunged into the sea of clouds. Dark was the sky, moonless. The stars shone like broken diamonds. The clouds were a floor of lava. We drifted. We stared up into the heavens. I anchored the flyer like an eye set to hover, and lit a cigarette myself. "You are older than I am," she finally said. "Really, you know?" "No." "There is a certain wisdom, a certain strength, something like the essence of the time that passes, that seeps into a man as he sleeps between the stars. I know because I can feel it when I'm around you." "No," I said. "Then maybe it's people expecting you to have the strength of centuries that gives you something like it. It was probably there to begin with." "No." She chuckled. "It isn't exactly a positive sort of thing, either." I laughed. "You asked me if I was going to run for office again this fall. The answer is no. I'm planning on retiring. I want to settle down." "With anyone special?" "Yes, very special, Juss," she said, and she smiled at me, and I kissed her, but not for too long, because the ash was about to fall off her cigarette and down the back of my neck. So we put both cigarettes out and drifted above the invisible city, beneath a sky without a moon. I mentioned earlier that I would tell you about stopovers. If you are going a distance of 145 light-years and are taking maybe 150 actual years to do it, why stop and stretch your legs? Well, first of all and mainly, almost nobody sleeps out the whole jaunt.
There are lots of little gadgets which require human monitoring at all times. No one is going to sit there for 150 years and watch them all by himself, so everybody takes a turn or two, passengers included. They are all briefed on what to do till the doctor comes, and who to awaken and how to go about it should troubles crop up. Then everyone takes a turn at guard mount for a month or so, along with a few companions. There are always hundreds of people aboard, and after you've worked down through the roll, you take it again from the top. All sorts of mechanical agents are backing them up, many of which they are unaware of, to protect against them as well as with them, in the improbable instance of several oddballs getting together and deciding to open a window, change course, murder passengers, or things like that. And the people are well screened and carefully matched up so as to check and balance each other as well as the machinery. All of this because gadgets and people both bear watching. After several turns at ship's guard, interspersed with periods of cold sleep, you tend to grow claustrophobic and somewhat depressed. Hence, when there is an available stopover, it is utilized to restore mental equilibrium and to re-arouse flagging animal spirits. This also serves the purpose of enriching the life and economy of the stopover world by whatever information and activities you may have in you. Stopover, therefore, has become a traditional holiday on many worlds, characterized by festivals and celebrations on some of the smaller ones, and often by parades and worldwide broadcast interviews and press conferences on those with greater populations. I understand that it is now pretty much the same on Earth, too, whenever colonial visitors stop by. In fact, one fairly unsuccessful young starlet, Marilyn Austin, made a long voyage out, stayed a few months, and returned on the next vessel headed back. After appearing on Tri-D a couple of times, sounding off about interstellar culture, and flashing her white teeth, she picked up a flush contract, a third husband, and her first big part in tapes, all of which goes to show the value of stopovers. I landed us atop Helix, Betty's largest apartment complex, wherein Eleanor had her double-balconied corner suite, affording views both of the distant Noble and of the lights of Posh Valley, Betty's residential section. Eleanor prepared steaks with baked potato, cooked corn, beer, everything I liked. I was happy and sated and such, and I stayed until around midnight, making plans for our future. Then I took a cab back to Town Square, where I was parked. When I arrived, I thought I'd check with the trouble center just to see how things were going. So I entered the hall, stamped my feet, brushed off excess waters, hung my coat, and proceeded up the empty hallway to the elevator. The elevator was too quiet. They're supposed to rattle, you know. They shouldn't sigh softly and have doors that open and close without a sound. So I walked around an embarrassing corner on my way to the trouble center. It was a pose Rodin might have enjoyed working with. All I can say is that it's a good thing I stopped by when I did, rather than 5 or 10 minutes later. Chuck Fuller and Lottie, Eleanor's secretary, were practicing mouth-to-mouth resuscitation and keeping the victim warm techniques there on the couch in the little alcove off to the side of the big door to TC. Chuck's back was to me, but Lottie spotted me over his shoulder, and her eyes widened, and she pushed him away. He turned his head quickly. "Jus," he said. I nodded. "Just passing by," I told him. "Thought I'd stop in to say hello and take a look at the eyes." Everything's going real well," he said, stepping back into the hallway. "It's on auto right now, and I'm on my, coffee break. Lottie is on night duty, and she came by to see if we had any reports we needed typed. She had a dizzy spell, so we came out here where the couch—" "Yeah, she looks a little peaked," I said. "There are smelling salts and aspirins in the medicine chest." I walked on by into the center, feeling awkward. Chuck followed me after a couple of minutes. I was watching the screens when he came up beside me. Things appeared to be somewhat in hand, though the rains were still moistening the 130 views of Betty. Jus," he said, "I didn't know you were coming by." "Obviously." "What I'm getting at is, you won't report me, will you?" "No, I won't report you." "And you wouldn't mention it to Cynthia, would you?" "Your extracurricular activities," I said, "are your own business. As a friend, I suggest you do them on your own time and in a more propitious location. But it's already beginning to slip my mind. I'm sure I'll forget the whole thing in another minute." "Thanks, Jus," he said. I nodded. "What's Weather Central have to say these days?" I asked, raising the phone. He shook his head, so I dialed and listened. "Bad," I said, hanging up. "More wet to come." "Damn," he announced, and lit a cigarette, his hand shaking. This weather's getting me down." "Me too," said I. "I'm going to run now because I want to get home before it starts in bad again. I'll probably be around tomorrow. See you." "Night." I elevated back down, fetched my coat, and left. I didn't see Lottie anywhere about, but she probably was, waiting for me to go. I got to my car and was halfway home before the faucets came on full again. The sky was torn open with lightnings, and a sizzle cloud stalked the city like a long-legged arachnid, forking down bright limbs and leaving tracks of fire where it went. I made it home in another 15 minutes, and the phenomenon was still in progress as I entered the garage. As I walked up the alley, cane switched on, I could hear the distant sizzle and the rumble, and a steady half-light filled the spaces between the buildings from its flash-burn striding. Inside I listened to the thunder and the rain, and I watched the apocalypse off in the distance. Delirium of a city under storm. The buildings across the way were quite clear in the pulsing light of the thing. The lamps were turned off in my apartment so that I could better appreciate the vision. All of the shadows seemed incredibly black and inky, lying right beside glowing stairways, pediments, window sills, balconies, and all of that which was illuminated seemed to burn as though with an internal light. Overhead the living, not-living insect thing of fire stalked, and an eye wearing a blue halo was moving across the tops of nearby buildings. The fires pulsed and the clouds burnt like the hills of Gehenna. The thunders burbled and banged, and the white rain drilled into the roadway which had erupted into a steaming lather. Then a snapper, tri-horned, wet-feathered, demon-faced, sword-tailed, and green, raced from around a corner a moment after I'd heard a sound which I had thought to be a part of the thunder. The creature ran at an incredible speed along the smoky pavement. The eye swooped after it, adding a hail of lead to the falling raindrops. Both vanished up another street. It had taken but an instant, but in that instant it had resolved a question in my mind as to whom should do the painting. Not El Greco, not Blake, no. Bosch. Without any question, Bosch, with his nightmare visions of the streets of hell. He would be the one to do justice to this moment of the storm. I watched until the sizzle cloud drew its legs up into itself, hung like a burning cocoon, then died like an ember retreating into ash. Suddenly it was very dark, and there was only the rain. Sunday was the day of chaos. Candles burned, churches burned, people drowned, beasts ran wild in the streets, or swam there. Houses were torn up by the roots and bounced like paper boats along the waterways. The great wind came down upon us, and after that the madness. I was not able to drive to Town Hall, so Eleanor sent her flyer after me. The basement was filled with water, and the ground floor was like Neptune's waiting room. All previous high-water marks had been passed. We were in the middle of the worst storm in Betty's history. Operations had been transferred up onto the 3rd floor. There was no way to stop things now. It was just a matter of riding it out and giving what relief we could. I sat before my gallery and watched. It rained buckets. It rained vats. It rained swimming pools and lakes and rivers. For a while it seemed that it rained oceans upon us. This was partly because of the wind, which came in from the Gulf and suddenly made it seem to rain sideways with the force of its blasts. It began at about noon and was gone in a few hours, but when it left our town was broken and bleeding. Wyeth lay on his bronze side. The flagpole was gone. There was no building without broken windows and water inside. We were suddenly suffering lapses of electrical power, and one of my eyes showed 3 panda puppies devouring a dead child. Cursing, I killed them across the rain and the distance. Eleanor wept at my side. There was a report later of a pregnant woman who could only deliver by cesarean section, trapped on a hilltop with her family and in labor. We were still trying to get through to her with a flyer, but the winds. I saw burning buildings and the corpses of people and animals. I saw half-buried cars and splintered homes. I saw waterfalls where there had been no waterfalls before. I fired many rounds that day, and not just at beasts from the forest. 16 of my eyes had been shot out by looters. I hope I never again see some of the films I made that day. When the worst Sunday night in my life began, and the rains did not cease, I knew the meaning of despair for the 3rd time in my life. Eleanor and I were in the trouble center. The lights had just gone out for the 8th time. The rest of the staff was down on the 3rd floor. We sat there in the dark, without moving, without being able to do a single thing to halt the course of chaos. We couldn't even watch it until the power came back on. So we talked. Whether it was for 5 minutes or an hour, I don't really know. I remember telling her, though, about the girl buried on another world whose death had set me to running. 2 trips to 2 worlds, and I had broken my bond with the times. But 100 years of travel do not bring a century of forgetfulness, not when you cheat time with the petite mort of the cold sleep. Time's vengeance is memory, and though for an age you plunder the eye of seeing and empty the ear of sound, when you awaken your past is still with you. The worst thing to do, then, is to return to visit your wife's nameless grave in a changed land, to come back as a stranger to the place you had made your home. You run again, then, and after a time you do forget some, because a certain amount of actual time must pass for you also. But by then you are alone, all by yourself, completely alone. That was the first time in my life that I knew the meaning of despair. I read, I worked, I drank, I whored, but came the morning after, and I was always me, by myself. I jumped from world to world, hoping things would be different, but with each change I was further away from all the things I had known. Then another feeling gradually came upon me, and a really terrible feeling it was. There must be a time and a place best suited for each person who has ever lived. After the worst of my grief had left me, and I had come to terms with the vanished past, I wondered about a man's place in time and in space. Where and when in the cosmos would I most like to live out the balance of my days, to live at my fullest potential? The past was dead, but perhaps a better time waited on some as yet undiscovered world, waited at one yet-to-be-recorded moment in its history. How could I ever know? How could I ever be sure that my golden age did not lay but one more world away, and that I might be struggling in a dark era, while the renaissance of my days was but a ticket, a visa, and a diary page removed? That was my second despair. I did not know the answer until I came to the land of the swan. I do not know why I loved you, Eleanor, but I did, and that was my answer. Then the rains came. When the lights returned, we sat there and smoked. She had told me of her husband, who had died a hero's death in time to save him from the delirium tremors which would have ended his days. Died as the bravest die, not knowing why, because of a reflex, which after all had been a part of him, a reflex which had made him cast himself into the path of a pack of wolf-like creatures attacking the exploring party he was with, off in that forest at the foot of St. Stephen's, to fight them with a machete, and to be torn apart by them while his companions fled to the camp, where they made a stand and saved themselves. Such is the essence of valor, an unthinking moment, a spark along the spinal nerves, predetermined by the sum total of everything you have ever done, wished to do or not to do, and wish you had done or hadn't, and then comes the pain. We watched the gallery on the wall. Man is the reasoning animal, greater than beasts but less than angels. Not the murderer I shot that night. He wasn't even the one who uses tools or buries his dead. Laughs, aspires, affirms, I didn't see any of those going on. Watches himself watch himself doing what he knows is absurd? Too sophisticated. He just did the absurd without watching. Like running back into a burning house after his favorite pipe and a can of tobacco. Devises religions? I saw people praying, but they weren't devising. They were making last-ditch efforts at saving themselves after they'd exhausted everything else they knew to do. Reflex. The creature who loves. That's the only one I might not be able to gainsay. I saw a mother holding her daughter up on her shoulders while the water swirled about her armpits, and the little girl was holding her doll up above her shoulders in the same way. But isn't that, the love, a part of the total, of everything you have ever done or wished, positive or neg? I know that it is what made me leave my post running, and what made me climb into Eleanor's flyer, and what made me fight my way through the storm and out to that particular scene. I didn't get there in time. I shall never forget how glad I was that someone else did. Johnny Keams blinked his lights above me as he rose, and he radioed down, "It's all right, they're okay, even the doll." "Good," I said, and headed back. As I set the ship down on its balcony landing, one figure came toward me. As I stepped down, a gun appeared in Chuck's hand. "I wouldn't kill you, Just," he began, "but I'd wound you." "Face that wall. I'm taking the flyer." "Are you crazy?" I asked him. "I know what I'm doing. I need it, Jess." "Well, if you need it, there it is. You don't have to point a gun at me. I just got through needing it myself. Take it." "Lottie and I both need it," he said. "Turn around." I turned toward the wall. "What do you mean?" I asked. "We're going away together, now." "You are crazy," I said. "This is no time." "Come on, Lottie," he called, and there was a rush of feet behind me, and I heard the flyer's door open. "Chuck," I said, "we need you now. You can settle this thing peacefully in a week, in a month, after some order has been restored. There are such things as divorces, you know." "That won't get me off this world, Jus." "So how is this going to?" I turned, and I saw that he had picked up a large canvas bag from somewhere and had it slung over his left shoulder like Santa Claus. "Turn back around. I don't want to shoot you," he warned. The suspicion came, grew stronger. "Chuck, have you been looting?" I asked him. "Turn around." "All right, I'll turn around. How far do you think you'll get?" "Far enough," he said. "Far enough so that no one will find us, and when the time comes, we'll leave this world." "No," I said, "I don't think you will, because I know you." "We'll see." His voice was further away then. I heard 3 rapid footsteps and the slamming of a door. I turned then in time to see the flyer rising from the balcony. I watched it go. I never saw either of them again. Inside, 2 men were unconscious on the floor. It turned out they were not seriously hurt. After I saw them cared for, I rejoined Eleanor in the tower. All that night did we wait, emptied, for morning. Somehow it came. We sat and watched the light flow through the rain. So much had happened so quickly, so many things had occurred during the past week that we were unprepared for morning. It brought an end to the rains. A good wind came from out of the north and fought with the clouds like Enki with the serpent Tiamat. Suddenly there was a canyon of cobalt. A cloud-quake shook the heavens, and chasms of light opened across its dark landscape. It was coming apart as we watched. I heard a cheer, and I croaked in unison with it as the sun appeared. The good, warm, drying, beneficent sun drew the highest peak of St. Stephen's to its face and kissed both its cheeks. There was a crowd before each window. I joined one and stared, perhaps for 10 minutes. When you awaken from a nightmare, you do not normally find its ruins lying about your bedroom. This is one way of telling whether or not something was only a bad dream or whether or not you were really awake. We walked the streets in great boots. Mud was everywhere. It was in basements and in machinery and in sewers and in living-room clothes closets. It was on buildings and on cars and on people and on the branches of trees. It was broken brown blisters drying and waiting to be peeled off from clean tissue. Swarms of sky toads rose into the air when we approached, hovered like dragonflies, returned to spoiling food stores after we had passed. Insects were having a heyday, too. Betty would have to be deloused. So many things were overturned or fallen down and half buried in the brown sargassos of the streets. The dead had not yet been numbered. The water still ran by, but sluggish and foul. A stench was beginning to rise across the city. There were smashed-in storefronts, and there was glass everywhere, and bridges fallen down, and holes in the streets. But why go on? If you don't get the picture by now, you never will. It was the big morning after, following a drunken party by the gods. It is the lot of mortal man always to clean up their leavings, or to be buried beneath them. So clean we did, but by noon Eleanor could no longer stand, so I took her home with me because we were working down near the harbor section and my place was nearer. That's almost the whole story, light to darkness to light, except for the end, which I don't really know. I'll tell you of its beginning, though. I dropped her off at the head of the alleyway, and she went on toward my apartment while I parked the car. Why didn't I keep her with me? I don't know, unless it was because the morning sun made the world seem at peace despite its filth. Unless it was because I was in love and the darkness was over, and the spirit of the night had surely departed. I parked the car and started up the alley. I was halfway before the corner where I had met the org when I heard her cry out. I ran. Fear gave me speed and strength, and I ran to the corner and turned it. The man had a bag, not unlike the one Chuck had carried away with him, lying beside the puddle in which he stood. He was going through Eleanor's purse, and she lay on the ground, so still, with blood on the side of her head. I cursed him and ran toward him, switching on my cane as I went. He turned, dropped her purse, and reached for the gun in his belt. We were about 30 feet apart, so I threw my cane. He drew his gun, pointed it at me, and my cane fell into the puddle in which he stood. Flights of angels sang him to his rest. Perhaps. She was breathing, so I got her inside and got hold of a doctor. I don't remember how, not too clearly anyway. And I waited and waited. She lived for another 12 hours, and then she died. She recovered consciousness twice before they operated on her, and not again after. She didn't say anything. She smiled at me once and went to sleep again. I don't know. Anything, really. It happened again that I became Betty's mayor, to fill in until November, to oversee the rebuilding. I worked my head off, and I left her bright and shiny as I had found her. I think I could have won if I had run for the job that fall, but I did not want it. The town council overrode my objections and voted to erect a statue of Godfrey Justin Holmes beside the statue of Eleanor Shearer, which was to stand in the square across from cleaned-up Wyeth. I guess it's out there now. I said that I would never return, but who knows? In a couple of years, after some more history has passed, I may revisit a Betty full of strangers, if only to place a wreath at the foot of the one statue. Who knows but that the entire continent may be steaming and clanking and whirring with automation by then, and filled with people from shore to shining shore? There was a stopover at the end of the year, and I waved good-bye and climbed aboard and went away, anywhere. I went aboard and went away to sleep again the cold sleep. Delirium of ship among stars. Years have passed, I suppose. I'm not really counting them any more. But I think of this thing often. Perhaps there is a golden age someplace, a renaissance for me sometime, a special time somewhere but a ticket, a visa, a diary page away. I don't know where or when. Who does? Where are all the rains of yesterday? In the invisible city? Inside me? It is cold and quiet outside, and the horizon is infinity. There is no sense of movement. There is no moon, and the stars are very bright, like broken diamonds all.